Hello class, thank you so much for joining me. So today's lecture is the first lecture in our last unit in this class, a unit on labor market discrimination. And as a result, I want to spend a minute talking about how today's material fits into this broader vision of the labor market that we've been building. So up until now, we've kind of looked at two big visions of how the labor market works. One that's come out of our competitive models and one that's come out of our monopsonistic models. So in our competitive labor market vision, we have concluded that in equilibrium, workers should be paid based on the value of their marginal product, right? In other words, wage equals marginal revenue product. And this has gotten complicated over time, right? Once we add non-wage amenities, we're going to want to say something like the value of workers' compensation is going to have to equal the value of their marginal revenue product. Once we've added human capital, especially firm-specific human capital, we've had to say something like the present discounted value of the full stream of workers' compensation is going to have to equal the present discounted value of the full stream of workers' marginal revenue products. But even so, we've come to this broad conclusion that if we want to understand how workers are paid, we have to understand what workers produce. And in this vision, if we want to understand things like growing inequality or wage stagnation, we need to think about worker productivity, right? So if we think about growing inequality, we'll see this as primarily a problem of some workers having fewer opportunities to increase their productivity than others. Right, and we'll want to address that through things like increased education or potentially policies designed to either increase the availability of complements to certain types of workers or decrease the availability of substitutes to certain types of workers. On the other hand, the other vision of the labor market comes out of our work on non-competitive labor markets, right? Has come out of our work on monopsony power. And in this work, we've concluded that in some circumstances, workers might get paid a lot less than they produce, right? If firms have market power over workers, they can pay workers a lot less than their marginal productivity, and as a result, their marginal revenue product. And as a result, if we want to understand things like wage stagnation or inequality, we might want to think about the relative power of workers in firms, right? And therefore, we might want to go towards policies like minimum wages or increased unionization as tools to equalize the power of workers and the power of firms. So this unit is going to focus on another reason that workers might not get paid the value of their productivity. Workers might not get paid their marginal revenue product. And that is discrimination in the workplace. So in this unit, we're going to explore the ways in which prejudices against certain types of workers, such as women or racial minorities, might result or might not result in persistent differences in pay between these groups that don't reflect differences in productivity between those groups, or at the very least don't reflect differences in potential productivity of these groups. So we'll talk about a couple of different models that come to strikingly different conclusions about the possibility of that kind of labor market discrimination persisting in a competitive equilibrium. And then we'll explore some of the empirical evidence around this question. So today's lecture is going to specifically focus on several models developed by an economist named Becker in the 1950s. And these models are important because they're some of the first pieces of economic research, economic theory, focused on the question of discrimination. And we're going to think through these models for a couple reasons. First is just because they're such fundamental pieces of all future theoretical work on discrimination. But the second is that they come to a set of very powerful theoretical conclusions about when we should and should not be able to see persistent discrimination in labor markets, persistent wage differences in labor markets, that don't feel like they can be true in a lot of empirical contexts. So we'll spend future lectures thinking about why these models might not reflect reality or some details of these models that might give us a better look at reality. So what these models do is fundamentally they think about the role that prejudice can play in the labor market. So they're not going to talk about where prejudices come from, and they're not going to talk about why prejudices exist, but they're going to think about how the effect of how prejudice is held by different actors in society, so held by employers, held by other kinds of other workers, or held by customers, might affect wages of marginalized workers. So to start out, before we get too deep into these models, I just want to be a little bit clear about my language here. When I talk about prejudice, I'm talking about negative perceptions of one group of people held by some other group of people. So negative perceptions of a group, or another way to think about it is preferences for interacting with the group. And on the other hand, I'm going to talk about discrimination as actions taken to distance yourself from one group relative to another. So in other words, I'll say that employers are prejudiced against a certain group of workers if they have preferences against hiring that group of workers. And I'll say that employers are discriminating against that group of workers if they choose not to hire a certain group of workers or choose to pay a group of workers less because of their group status. So fundamentally, what Beckers models are about is about trying to explore when prejudices that exist for reasons outside of the model will and will not lead to discrimination. Okay, great. I'll see you in the next video.